Welcome back everyone for the 11th episode of my campaign review and tier list series. Thankfully, it's only been a few months since the last episode, but for those who are new or need a recap, this is the series where I review each of AoE2 DE's official campaigns, breaking each down scenario by scenario, evaluating its strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately placing them on the tier list. Each episode covers 3 campaigns, going in chronological order from Alaric all the way through Bayanong, until we ran out of campaigns and started going into DLCs. Today is of course the 11th episode of the series, meaning we've completed 30 campaigns so far. Today's video is going to be all about Dynasties of India, where we will cover Devapala, Rajendra, Prithviraj, again briefly, and then Babur. As always, I would just like to take a quick moment to say that these videos take a ton of time and energy to make, so if you were hyped for this mega episode, please be sure to leave a like, comment on what you think of these campaigns, and of course subscribe to the channel for tons more AoE2 content. Now that we have properly sold out, it's finally time to travel to the rivers and jungles of Bengal to start our campaigning. Indeed, we're still going to go in chronological order, so that makes Devapala our first entry of the day. Lasting from 810 to 850, this is actually the 4th oldest campaign in the AoE2 timeframe. Devapala is going to be AoE2 DE's showcase of the Bengali civilization and was designed by Haki Sam. This campaign chronicles the tale and rise of the Pala Empire of Bengal under the rule of Devapala. Notably, each Dynasties of India campaign covers one of the 3 main religious groups living in South Asia during the Middle Ages, with the Palas being the last major Buddhist empire in India, and this is heavily reflected by Devapala's attempts to rule his kingdom benevolently and follow the Eightfold Path. Considering its difficulty, the devs placed Devapala in the one sword or easy category. This totally makes sense, as not only is this campaign very straightforward in its gameplay, but it also serves as an excellent showcase of the Dynasties of India expansion as a whole. So with that, let's see what our enlightened ruler has in store for us in the Devapala scenarios. We kick things off with Dissatisfaction. That's not my opinion of the campaign, it's just the title of the first level. To secure the borders of the Pala heartland in Bengal, Devapala sends his cousin and chief general Jayapala to conquering the neighboring lands of Kamarupa and Utkala. You begin with a small but mighty force of elephants and rathas to the east of the map, and must first defeat Kamarupa. Their town is only lightly defended, and if you manage to defeat its garrison and secure the town without losing a unit, you will be rewarded with the Castle Age upgrade. From there, you get your main objective of simply defeating Utkala, which consists of a sprawling camp to the southwest. In addition, Utkala is getting support from your 2 main rival factions, the Pratiharas and the Rashtrakutas, each of whom have a small camp. These guys will raid you a bit, but taking them out will secure you the Imperial Age Cavalry Blacksmith upgrades. Beyond that, the only other points of interest on the map are the few relics scattered around, and the Bay of Bengal, which is home to plenty of fish. So as you will see, the title of each scenario in this campaign references one of the noble truths of Buddhism, with this being the first one, Dissatisfaction. Overall, this is a very simple scenario, but it does introduce you to all of the main factions we will see in the Devapala campaign, as well as underscore our ruler's goal of attempting to become a bodhisattva, aka a great figure who delays their own nirvana in order to guide others towards it. That's great and all, but you do have to reconcile with that pile of dead bodies you just created. So nothing too crazy here, but I am nonetheless satisfied with this scenario as the introduction to the Bengalis and the Dynasties of India DLC. Oh yeah, here you will find the first, but certainly not the last, Star Wars prequel reference in this campaign. When defeated, the Rashtrakutas say, "You have bested us now, young Palas. We will watch your activities with great interest." Our second noble truth and Devapala scenario is Desire, where we relive the famous tripartite struggle for the city of Kanauj, an important location in north-central India. You must once again square off against the other great powers of India in the 3-way battle. Your camp is to the north and east of the map, the Pratiharas have a camp to the west, and will train various camel, cavalry, and elephant units, and the Rashtrakutas are to the south, and they will train infantry and elephant archers. The goal for all 3 sides is the city of Kanauj in the center of the map, particularly its monument. Someone capturing it will start a 550 in-game year countdown, and then the rest of the scenario plays out like a very straightforward King of the Hill game. Just take control of the monument and don't let go until the timer counts down to 0. There are a couple of small side quests. Training 10 of your Ratha unique units will grant you the otherwise inaccessible elite upgrade, and repairing the damaged monasteries of Kanauj will grant you the ability to build your own monasteries, as well as the Mahayana unique tech. Alright, so once again we find ourselves with a very straightforward scenario in Desire. It really is a showcase of all 3 Dynasties of India civs, as you are the Bengalis, the Pratiharas are the Gujars, and the Rashtrakutas are the Dravidians, and each side trains the sort of units that it's good at. The one knock on this scenario is that it's very straightforward and easy, and so you will have no difficulty booming up and flattening everything with your army of elephants and rathas. As you can see in the background footage, it's fairly easy to defeat both of your enemies before the timer even finishes. Oh yeah, our Star Wars Wars reference here once again comes from the Rashtrakutas, as defeating them will have Jayapala inform your foes that there is always a bigger fish. The third noble truth/scenario is Renunciation, where we renounce our war against the Rashtrakutas and Pratiharas to deal with a common enemy, the nomadic Hunas from the northwest. However, you are still trying to be a bodhisattva and therefore have a choice in this mission, to either kill or convert the 3 Khans of the Hunas. Killing a Khan will complete your objective, but converting him will turn all of the nearby Hunas into your allies. You start to the east of the map and can build up a robust base quite quickly. The Hunas are largely spread across 3 camps, each of which is home to a Khan, one right outside your base, one to the far north, and one in the far west. In addition to the Hunas, you can potentially deal with their capital of Multan, which occupies the center. They are even stronger than the Hunas, and will eventually start a relic victory countdown, but they are not technically necessary to defeat. Finally, the Pratiharas are greatly weakened from the last scenario, and their small villages to the south can be either raided for loot or bribed for support. Okay, so I've got mixed feelings about Renunciation. Thematically, I think it's spot on with the more pious focus, but still having to attack your common enemies. I think the conversion mechanic is cool and again appropriate. The issue just comes from the fact that it's so easy. You barely need to attack anything to win the mission. Just have a few units in front of the monks as a meat shield, and then go ahead and convert the Khans. You even have a sneaky transport and monk that you can find to the northeast to easily convert the northernmost Khan without losing a unit. All of this feels wasted on a scenario where you can get to a 150 pop post-imp army and get potentially 2 allies to help you out. But still, this is supposed to be an easy campaign. I don't know. Our last noble truth, but our second to last scenario, is liberation. Unfortunately, Devapala has fallen to his own self-righteousness and now leads a campaign to the south against his former allies, the Pandyas, in order to force them to learn the teachings of the Buddha. You start to the northeast of the map with a sizable camp. All along the coast to the southwest lie the 3 castles of the Pandyas. Your first task is to destroy all 3 of these, with the twist being that you cannot train any villagers, so you need to rely on either looting enemy buildings or fishing to get resources. Also, you are encouraged to not stray too far from the enlightened path, and if you manage to destroy all of the Pandya castles before killing 100 units, you will be rewarded with 3 relics. Regardless, once the Pandyas are pacified, the nearby Rashtrakutas will grow angry that you attacked their neighbors, and begin building a wonder to the north of the map. Destroying this wonder before the countdown timer reaches 0 will win you the scenario. To help along the way, there are several Rashtrakuta camps that you can conquer for more buildings and resources. Okay, so liberation definitely hits home with the Devapala has gone mad with power idea. The Pandyas are pretty weak, and it really takes little effort to sweep them aside. You also get a bit of a chance to utilize the Bengali navy, which you have hitherto had little opportunity to utilize. Not surprisingly, my only complaint with this scenario is that it's very easy. The flavor is totally there, and it's an interesting gameplay concept. It's just not remotely difficult to annihilate the Rashtrakutas and take down their wonder before it's even halfway completed. Oh yeah, and I'm pretty sure that the Rashtrakuta taunt, "Are you going to kill me, Devapala?" is another Star Wars prequel reference. The final scenario is the result of the final noble truth as we follow the eightfold path to enlightenment. Devapala realizes the mistakes he has made, and after much prayer and meditation, vows to stick to his Mahayana principles. Unfortunately, your old friends, the Pratiharas and Rashtrakutas, see this moment as an opening to wage one final war against you, and that brings us to the goal in this final mission: simply defeat the Rashtrakutas and Pratiharas. You begin with an expansive camp to the east and north of the map, and are partially shielded by the forces of your cousin, Jayapala. Meanwhile, across the dense jungles and flooded rivers, the bases of the Pratiharas and Rashtrakutas lie to the south and west, respectively. Now, the interesting mechanic in this scenario comes from the piety counter that you get on the side of the screen. This side objective is to increase your piety count as much as possible through tasks like researching university upgrades, finding relics and monasteries, converting units, and building a wonder. As your piety count increases, you will get several useful bonuses like increased gold income and extra battle elephant attack. Beyond that, this mission is basically your big final battle, so just go crush them with your elephants. Alright, so I definitely think Enlightenment ends the Devapala campaign on a high note. The scope is totally there for a finale, as you get to use the full might of the Bengali Imperial Age to deal with your 2 rivals, who also get the full Imperial Age armies and navies. However, the piety counter mechanic not only makes the scenario more interesting gameplay-wise, but also reinforces the theme of Devapala trying to make amends and walk the path of a bodhisattva. Lastly, our Rashtrakuta friends give us one more Star Wars prequel reference by commenting on how Devapala is being consumed by anger and hatred and becoming the very thing he sought to destroy. Okay, so now that we have gone through each scenario of the Devapala campaign, it's time to zoom out a little bit and see how the pieces of our Bengali puzzle fit together. There are definitely some interesting things to talk about here. So we here around these parts always start with the campaign's strengths, and when it comes to Devapala, there is quite a bit to like. In my opinion, at a very basic level, this campaign hits every mark in doing what it's supposed to, provide an approachable showcase of the Dynasties of India DLC. Bengalis as a civilization are just one that lends themselves to fun campaign experiences. You get some very powerful units and can smash your opponents with a deadly late-game army of elephants, siege, and rathas. The elephant focus especially showcases the new regional units of the elephant archers and siege elephants, so again, you can see how this highlights the Dynasties of India DLC as a whole. Beyond that, you spend most of the campaign fighting the Gujars and the Dravidians, aka the other two new civs from the expansion. This is also done in a more large-scale late-game setting, so all of the fun new toys those civs have to offer get a chance to appear. When it comes to the scenarios themselves, they are all very straightforward, macro-oriented missions with a focus on the late game. This is the sort of thing that appeals to more casual players, and from that perspective, Devapala is just a very approachable campaign. In addition to the campaign's showcase of the Bengalis and Dynasties of India expansion, I also have to give a shout out to its characters and attention to detail. Devapala himself is shown to be a headstrong ruler that is genuinely trying to do what's right for his empire, but is led astray by the temptations of power and glory. However, he does have the support of his Hindu monk friend and advisor, the campaign's narrator Viradeva. The monk's teachings serve as a nice foil to the belligerent councils of Jayapala, and the whole narrative is surprisingly wholesome for an AoE2 campaign. The ending where Devapala and Viradeva are together walking the Eightfold Path is much happier than the ends for most of the protagonists in AoE2. Relatedly, the themes of Buddhism found throughout Devapala, from the intro and outro slides to even the names of the missions, are quite well done. Then you have the Star Wars Easter eggs, which are a nice touch for sure. Lastly, for the strengths, there's a bit of a bone thrown to the more experienced AoE2 campaign players in Devapala, with the tools given to facilitate speed runs. Pretty much every scenario can be rushed with some sort of mechanic, Gaia unit, or even objective that makes speedrunning Devapala pretty approachable, which is especially nice to have in a campaign that is otherwise so easy. Speaking of which, Devapala may have very few flaws, but there is one that sticks out like a sore thumb. Yes, the campaign is just really way too easy. I know this is supposed to be an introductory campaign to Dynasties of India, but for realsies, each expansion only gives us 3 campaigns, sort of. And this barely feels like a step up from Joan of Arc and El Cid. It almost makes me wish that there was another real Bengali campaign that actually challenges the players to utilize the population efficiency and economic power of the civilization. Either that or maybe just make the hard difficulty, I don't know, a lot harder than moderate. So with our super duper high level analysis complete, it's time to compare the Devapala campaign to its peers by placing it on the tier list. Like in the previous couple episodes, I polled you guys to see how my viewers would place the campaign, and with exactly 700 votes, we have a clear majority putting the campaign in the B tier. Now, for myself, I am going to break with you guys and bump Devapala up to A tier. Yes, the campaign is very straightforward, but it does what it's designed to do quite well. Give the players an introduction to the Dynasties of India expansion with the new civs, units, and allow players to smash a bunch of stuff with Bengali elephants. Although it's a bit too easy for my taste, and for I think a lot of you guys based on your comments, the characters and general attention to detail would lead me to recommend Devapala to players of all skill levels. We now travel from the east to the south, from the lands of Buddhism to those of Hinduism in our next campaign, Rajendra. Lasting from 1007 to 1025, Rajendra is AoE2DE's showcase of the Dravidian civilization and was designed by Lord Bassi. Rajendra was a powerful ruler of the Chola Empire of South India, who fought for control of the waters of the Bay of Bengal by both land and sea. Nevertheless, despite Rajendra's efforts to rule justly, the twin poisons of treachery and corruption lead our protagonist towards a path of conquest. We actually saw a bit of a cameo of Rajendra during the Surya Varma in the first campaign, and we'll see some of that again later. In-game, Rajendra is considered a 3-sword difficulty campaign. Although probably not quite as complex as Yadviga, Rajendra's scenarios are very difficult when compared to the other campaigns, and although that appeals a lot to me as a player, it also might be a bit daunting for more casual fans. Now, with our Chola prince all set up, let's sail for the Rajendra campaign scenarios. Before he can become king, a young Rajendra must prove himself worthy to follow his father, the great Raja in the first scenario, The Successor. You begin with command of Rajendra, his general Orion, and several light cavalry arriving in the southeast of the map in the dead of night. Your enemy here is the Chalukyan dynasty of Western India, and it is their army that you must defeat in battle. Before you can do that, however, you need to get some sneaky raids in. You have around 6 minutes to do whatever damage you can to the Chalukyan forces, including taking over a military camp and sabotaging their elephant pens. After which, the sun rises resources, you get your villagers, and the scenario begins in earnest. To win, you must destroy the Chalukyan army, whose large camp sprawls across the center of the map, as well as destroy the 4 universities of their capital city of Manyaketa, which lies to the north. In addition, you have allies in the kingdom of Vengi to the east of the map, and potentially Kerala to the south. That said, if you choose to help rebuild Kerala, they will eventually turn on you once Rajendra gets news of his father's death, which is a good way into the level. Lastly, there are several villages that dot the map which you can choose to destroy for loot or liberate to protect. Alright, so the successor certainly does a good job of introducing you to the story of Rajendra, as well as setting you up for what you're in store for the rest of the campaign. Rajendra himself is portrayed as an idealistic young prince who is determined to be a far more benevolent ruler than his ruthless father, Rajaraja. And you do get some of that in the gameplay with the villagers that you can choose to liberate, as well as the allies you can recruit and protect. Beyond this, the scenario is pretty straightforward and reasonably challenging, as the Chalukyan army is quite large and you need to make good use of some population-efficient elephants to trample your way to victory. Solid start all around. The second Rajendra scenario has us journeying further south in Deeds of the Father. The various vassal kingdoms of the Chola Empire are beginning to rebel, trying to test the young king. Especially truculent is the kingdom of Sri Lanka, which Rajendra has to invade following in the footsteps of his father decades earlier. You begin with a naval fight and must land on the north side of the island to establish a foothold. After some brief scuffles, you begin with your first objective: establish control of the northern half of the island. In practical terms, this means conquering or pacifying the towns of Manaram and Polona. Destroying the towns will give you resources, whereas completing specific objectives and subjugating them will turn them over to you and give you an economy of your own. A similar story applies to the local villages: burn them for loot or conquer them for tribute. Upon doing this, you will get your final objective of the scenario: to capture the rebel king Mahinda, who is located in his stronghold of Rahuna to the south. Rahuna is a large city that takes up much of the island, and they'll put up a tough fight. However, you can cripple their defenses by seizing the Sri Lankan crown jewels in a fortress to the center of the map, upon which all of Rahuna's units will lose 4 attack, and the city will no longer train elephants. So we're definitely ramping up things quickly in Deeds of the Father, as the scenario is quite expansive, intricate, and challenging. That's not to say that any of those things are bad, as I actually enjoy the scenario, despite a few small bugs. The whole gradual process of conquering Sri Lanka by whatever means necessary is quite well done, with you starting with only a small village to the north and eventually ending up with control of the entire island. From the last scenario, you have the dichotomy at play where you can choose to be either benevolent or a tyrannical ruler with all of the villages, and this plays into the larger narrative that I'll discuss later. For Rajendra being only a 5-scenario long 3-sword campaign, the scope and challenge of Deeds of the Father feel totally spot on. We get to zoom out even more in the third Rajendra scenario, Rising Star. In this epic mission, we actually begin with a throwback to Suryavarman III, as we must finish safely escorting his envoy from Burma all the way across the Bay of Bengal to the Chola Empire in southern India. There are a couple of ways of going about this, but either way, you find yourself with a tricky A to B style opening. However, once you reach Tanjavur, you will gain control of the infrastructure of the Chola Empire, and you're given your main objective. You must accumulate 10 so-called prestige points. These points are gained by completing the numerous side quests, all of which focus on expanding your influence and power over the region. Naturally, you are not alone in southern India, and the other factions in the scenario are as follows. You have the Chalukyan Empire back, and although they are weakened from the first level, they still represent your strongest opponent and control vast lands to the north and west of the map. You don't need to destroy them completely, but you can gain a couple of prestige points by taking out their docks and stealing their relic. Vengi also returns from the first mission, once again as your ally. However, their forces are quite weak, and they'll constantly be attacked by the Chalukyans. Maintaining your castle in their town will yield you a prestige point, but losing it will not only lose you that point, but also switch Vengi's allegiance over to the Chalukyans, and then they'll start to attack you. Sri Lanka is also back from the second mission, and the island lies just off the southern tip of India. Like Vengi, they will give you a prestige point if you can maintain a castle there, but if not, the Sri Lankans will rise up against you until you can take back the castle. The Pandyan Dynasty of Madurai controls a somewhat small city to the southwest. They are your enemies initially, but damaging your castle will force them to bend the knee and give you a prestige point. However, at some point, they will betray you, forcing you to completely take them out in order to get that prestige point back. The Bengali pirates control the Bay of Bengal and will constantly harass you on the high seas. You can build a large fleet, construct a castle on their island stronghold, and eventually defeat them to gain prestige points. Finally, the Srivijaya Empire has an island outpost to the southeast. They are initially neutral, but you can gain prestige prestige points by creating a trade relationship with them. However, they will grow greedy, first by levying taxes on you and ultimately declaring war, so get that trade gold while you can. Alright, phew, there is so much going on here and I need to keep this quick. That said, this is honestly one of my favorite scenarios of the entire DLC. You have so many routes to victory, potentially making great use of the land and naval strengths of the Dravidians, all of your enemies and allies feel unique, and you get the overarching theme of the campaign of needing to balance conquest and diplomacy. The fourth Rajendra mission is Sacred Waters, and has us look back northeast to Bengal. In a much different style from the previous scenarios, you now need to race against the clock to defeat the Pala Empire that we played as in the previous campaign. You begin to the southwest of the map in the allied town of Vengi and must march up the coast to do battle against the Palas, who are camped around the delta of the Ganges River. Here you have no economy and must rely on conquered vassals and shipments of supplies from Tanjavur. Shortly after the mission begins, Mahipala begins constructing a wonder, hence the whole race against the clock thing. However, between you and your enemy lie a couple of other factions. Kalinga is a fairly weak kingdom that you will encounter first, and it should not be too much of an issue to take their city, resources, and production. However, they have many soldiers scattered around in the countryside, and their king will flee to a mountain fortress. Pillaging the countryside can be helpful, and killing the Kalinga king will give you plenty of extra resources, as well as the bracer and ring archer armor technologies. Next up is the fortified city of Utkala, and they're going to be a tougher nut to crack. That said, you can loop around the city into the jungle to find an easier way in, as well as a potential relic that you can give to monks in the city for more resources and chemistry. Now, you can finally array your forces against the Bengalis in a huge pitched battle, and destroying their 3 castles will win you the level. True to its name, Sacred Waters is a refreshing change of pace in the Rajendra campaign. Unlike the first 3 missions, you get no economy and have to act quickly due to the Wonder countdown. But that doesn't mean the scenario is easy, as you need to execute all of the side objectives properly if you are to stand a chance against the Palas. The creeping nature of your attack also feels quite unique, and the logistical challenges like maintaining supply lines and reinforcement points force the player to strategize a bit differently. A nice Dravidians versus Bengalis matchup to be sure. The finale for our Dravidian adventures bring us back to the warm waters of Nusantara in slaying the Vitra, which, by the way, is a mythological serpent in Hindu tradition that was slain by the god Indra. In our case, the enemy is Srivijaya, and we kind of redo Suryavarman 4 from the perspective of the Chola. You begin to the west of the map with a massive fleet, ready to descend on the island of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula. The first order of business is to establish a beachhead, and to do that, you need to damage one of the nearby castles to take the Srivijayan fortress for your own. Once you accomplish that, then you can begin to build up your economy and army, as well as receive your main objective: control 6 Srivijayan castles. These castles are scattered across the map and range from pretty well defended to super turbo mega well defended. To the north, on the Malaysian peninsula, you'll find the clashing armies of Suryavarman and the Tambralingas, the latter of which controls a castle that you can potentially seize. If you free up your Khmer allies, they will help you with the fight. Beyond that, there is Sailendra, a powerful Srivijayan province that lies to the far east of the map on the island of Java. Lastly, there are more local villages scattered throughout Sumatra, so for one final time you can choose to either capture them or destroy them. So slaying the Vitra is certainly an epic way to end a campaign. It is massive in scale, although a bit different from Rajendra 3. There, you're expanding out and conquering all of the lands around you, whereas in Rajendra 5, it's just one huge, straightforward fight against the Srivijayas, which is not a bad thing. The challenge level is quite high here, as your enemies throw a massive amount of units at you by both land and sea. The trick here is to balance your navy and army, and to creep across the map with your efficient Dravidian army to slowly win your greatest battle. Alrighty, so same drill as before, we've gone through the scenarios of the Rajendra campaign, so now it's time to broaden our analysis and consider how all of the scenarios contribute to the whole. Overall, I don't think it should come as any surprise that I think that Rajendra is a very strong campaign. Starting of course with the strengths, I feel like we have 2 distinct aspects to talk about: the unique gameplay and the overarching theme of corruption. When it comes to gameplay, Rajendra provides some pretty unique and challenging missions. Yes, all of them except the 4th level fall broadly into the build and destroy family, but there are so many unique factions and mechanics that they all feel distinct. The first scenario has the whole night raid in the beginning, as well as the other factions and objectives. The next mission gives the player more choices, as you need to decide whether or not you want to pacify the Sri Lankan cities or crush them, with each decision affecting how quickly you can get your own economy going. The 3rd level just has so much going on with it. All of the different players, prestige points, and even the A to B section in the beginning all feel interesting and unique. 4th, you have the pressing time limit, as well as the whole supply chain mechanic and general lack of an economy. Lastly, you have to invade Srivijaya and conduct a whole amphibious invasion against a single super powerful enemy. All of these settings and gameplay mechanics are quite diverse, and give the player different ways to experience the strengths of the Dravidian civilization. Even then, the scenarios do feel connected through certain mechanics, such as the decision to either spare or conquer local villages that you can find in almost all of the missions. This helps prevent the scenarios from feeling too random and jumping around South India, but also conveys the corruption theme that is omnipresent in the campaign. Speaking of which, let's talk about the corruption theme, shall we? So when I first started playing this campaign, I interpreted the word corruption to mean sleazy political backstabbing, but in actuality the corruption refers to the degradation of Rajendra's moral compass. In short, Rajendra begins the campaign as the idealistic young prince, reproachful of his father's iron-fisted policies. However, once ascending the throne, Rajendra begins to realize that the greatest setbacks come from his tolerance towards his enemies who are looking to betray him. As you go through the scenarios, you can see Rajendra wrestle with these concerns as his conquests yield him far greater power than his diplomatic efforts. This leads to the end of the campaign, where you get the whole Anakin-esque descent into evil, as Rajendra slays the Vitra of his own distaste for violence as he becomes a tyrant. All of this is really well done in my opinion, and it helps connect the otherwise far-flung scenarios of the campaign. Still, as always, no campaign is perfect, and Rajendra has a couple of small issues. First, I do need to say that many of the missions are kind of buggy due to them being so complex. For instance, the mechanic that we have in many of the missions where our units get extra attack if the heroes in combat are kept alive just don't work whatsoever. Similar to Jadwiga, this is not enough to ruin any one scenario, but it does rankle the playing experience just a little bit. Secondly, although the gameplay and narrative themes are nicely connected between the scenarios, the overall story does feel a bit too focused on Rajendra himself. This is only a minor complaint, but having the narrator be Rajendra, as well as the whole conflict campaign being mostly an internal one within Rajendra, the whole experience of the Chola Empire as the player of geopolitics in South Asia gets a bit lost. Maybe this could be amended with another scenario, but again, this is only a minor complaint. Now, with all of our analysis of Darth Rajendra the Wise complete, it's time to put him on the old tier list. So after a little more than 800 votes, we can see from the community poll that you guys rate our Dravidian adventures quite highly, with the plurality going for S tier, closely followed by A tier. For me, I do think we're looking at another S tier campaign, and just a really strong one in general. I wouldn't say the story is quite as memorable as something like Jadwiga, but the gameplay is one of the very best out there, as every single mission has something interesting going on. You get to utilize both the land and naval strengths of the Dravidian civilization, and face many different enemies in the process. The theme of corruption feels quite poignant, and Rajendra's descent into tyranny is very well done. Dravidians may not be the most popular civ on the ladder, but their campaign is definitely one I'd recommend for anybody looking for a fun challenge. Next, we journey from the jungles and oceans of the south to the deserts and plains of the west as we actually go back and take another look at the Prithviraj campaign. Yes, I did cover this campaign back in episode 4 of this series, but with the Dynasties of India DLC and the reworking of the Indian civilization, Prithviraj has actually changed to be the entry for the Gujjar civilization, and is actually available to anyone, even if you don't own the DLC. I'm going to make this quick, but I'll cover the most interesting changes made to the scenarios of the Prithviraj campaign. Notably, although the original campaign was done by Philadelphia, the remake of Prithviraj was made by Freeman 1302. The difficulty is still 2 swords, which is fine, so let's just jump right back into the Prithviraj campaign scenarios. Alrighty, so first we go back to Born of Fire, where Prithviraj must assert his rule over the Chauhan lands, dealing with threats from inside his family as well as the surrounding kingdoms. Since I've already described this scenario in much more detail back in episode 4, I'm just going to hit the highlights and the aspects that were changed with Dynasties of India. For a refresher, this is the level where you have to rescue one or both of the TCs right away, and then have to choose between hunting down Nagarjuna or to collect the 3 randomly spawning relics. There are several enemy factions, although none of them are necessary to destroy completely. Now for the new stuff. Things are pretty limited. Obviously, all of the civs that were previously Indians are now Gujars, as well as the Ghaznavids who used to be Persians are now Hindustanis. Interestingly, the Gujara civ switch actually makes saving both TCs somewhat difficult, as those siege elephants pack a punch. Other than the intro, much of the gameplay is quite similar, with the major exception being the feudal age start for you and most of your enemies, as well as the castle age restriction and 125 pop limit, compared to the 200 pop post-imp of the old version. These changes are quite welcome, and help make the mission feel a bit more like, well, an introduction scenario. Just nice small changes. Second in Prithviraj is the Digvijaya, or Conquest of All Directions, where our protagonist must assert his dominance over the other Rajas of Western India. The Civ swap here looks similar to the first scenario. All of the Indians factions are replaced with Gujars, Sumra used to be Tatars and they're now Hindustanis, and the Paramaras, who replaced the Naga, are Dravidians. As before, you begin with a bit of a tiger hunt, but now after killing the tiger, you are immediately given control of your starting village and can get to work. Your main task is still to snipe the 3 Rajas marked on your map, but thankfully the weird objective where you have to go back and destroy the wonder of the Nagas was replaced with a side quest involving the Paramaras. Their camp is where the Nagas used to hang out, and liberating them from the occupying dacoit bandits will give you resources, villagers, and Arumi swordsmen. Lastly, you are now restricted to the castle age and a pop limit of 150, which again adds to the whole building up in scope of the Prithviraj campaign. Our third scenario is the quick A to B escort mission Hand of a Princess, where Prithviraj and a few soldiers must sneak their way into the enemy capital of Kanauj to rescue Sanyogita from her father Jayachandra, as the two wish to elope. Now, I'll just go right ahead and say that this scenario is basically unchanged from the pre-Dynasties of India version. You still start with Prithviraj and some cavalry units to the west of the map, and must meander your way through the jungles, rivers, and mountains to Kanauj in the east, sweep away Sanyogita, and make it back to the safety of Lalkat in the north. The only real change here is that now everybody is Gujars instead of Indians, naturally, and you have some corresponding unit changes that would fit the civilization a bit more. Elephant archers, Shrivunsh riders, and chakram throwers, that sort of thing. This mission is super short anyway, so there wasn't really a whole lot that needed to be changed, and that's totally fine. In a similar vein, we have Prithviraj 4, The Fate of India, another short but sweet level with very few changes. If you guys recall, this is the mission where you have a deathmatch-like start with a ton of resources and production ready to get going, but so do your opponents. Your task is to snipe the 3 monasteries of the Gorids, each of which contains a relic. The countdown timer begins at the start of the game, but sniping a monastery will reset it. When it comes to changes, we're looking at the Red Gorids faction now going from Turks to Hindustanis, but since they train basically the same army, that doesn't matter too much. You also get a couple of transport ships now at the start, which can help speed you along in the early game to build some extra production buildings. But honestly, the biggest change here is simply that you're now playing as the Gujars and not the old Indians, and the two civs tend to go for a bit of a different army composition. Your elephant archers are not as good anymore, and your barracks is basically worthless. However, you have Shrivunsh riders and chakram throwers, and your camels are still quite potent. But still, these changes are more inherent to the civilization itself, rather than any design alterations. Last but not least, we have the Legend of Prithviraj, which is the one scenario that has been completely overhauled. The old version had a weird low eco thing going on where you could just get a couple of villagers and had to slowly grind your way through your enemies and convert the rival Rajas. Well, we still have that same general idea going on, but it's accomplished in a much more streamlined manner. You once again begin with the choice between 4 Rajas that you can convert. In this case, the Rajas are all located within small towns that are pretty near one another, and each comes with its own bonus. Once you do this, you can begin to build your economy. The catch here is that you cannot construct additional town centers in this level, but converting the subsequent Rajas will give you up to 4, as well as your pop limit of 200. The main goal here is still to defeat the Yadavas, Cholas, and Pagan, but the map layout is a fair bit different, now being centered on the Ganges Delta as opposed to the entirety of South Asia. The Yadavas are now Gujars instead of Indians, as the Cholas are now Dravidians. Lastly, the Gorids have not yet departed from the story. They have a sprawling camp to the north and east of the map, and although you do not need to defeat them, doing so will prevent their raids from harassing you throughout the game. So I gotta say, this version of The Legend of Prithviraj basically addresses all of the complaints I made in episode 4 of this series. The gameplay now much more closely resembles a traditional build and destroy experience, allowing the player to utilize the full late game arsenal of the Gujar civilization against several different opponents. Still, you are limited in your town centers, and the spirit of the scenario remains quite similar, with Chand Bardai trying to get the other Indian Rajas to help out against the Gorids. Speaking of which, one of my big complaints with the previous version of this mission was that the Gorids were nowhere to be found despite being the main threat of the campaign. I think it's fine that you don't need to defeat them, and it just nicely rounds out the whole experience in the new and improved The Legend of Prithviraj. Okay, so I've obviously already covered the strengths and weaknesses of the Prithviraj campaign in episode 4 of the series, so what I'm going to do here is briefly recap the points I made there, and then assess the degree to which the new changes affect them. In general, I don't think Dynasties of India made Prithviraj worse in any way, and indeed, I'd say that all of the scenarios are either about the same or better than they used to be. The strengths of this campaign are unchanged, the characters and the unique scenarios, that's all good. The big difference here is how the changes improve the issues I had with Prithviraj, namely the better scaling of scenarios and the wonky final level. When it comes to scaling, the earlier version of Prithviraj just gave you 200 pop post-imp in most of the levels, and that made the whole progression of the campaign feel quite off. In many ways, the first couple of scenarios felt grander in scale than the last one. Restricting a player's population and maximum age actually do a lot in making you feel like your empire is growing more powerful, and the newer version of the campaign does this quite nicely. You now start in the feudal age in the first mission with a 125 pop limit, and then it goes to 150 and access to the imperial age in the second mission, and it's just much clearer scaling throughout the campaign. Some of the more awkward parts of the scenarios, like the whole Naga thing in Prithviraj 2, have been reworked to just play out much more smoothly. Speaking of which, the final level is now so much better. It went from the weirdest and slowest mission in the campaign to a really big battle against a bunch of different South Asian civs, which is appropriate for the campaign's finale. Overall, the campaign just feels significantly more polished than it used to. So with all of that said, does Prithviraj get bumped up from its B tier rating? It's definitely a close call, but I would say yes, it does deserve a spot in the A tier. Although the Prithviraj campaign is at its heart quite similar to pre-Dynasties of India, most of the changes that were made with the new expansion directly address a lot of the issues I used to have with it. Like I said, the scaling is much better from start to finish, with the really underwhelming final scenario becoming one of the best in the whole campaign. Still, I don't think Prithviraj quite makes the cut for S tier, simply because the campaign feels really short due to having only 5 total scenarios, and then 2 of those scenarios are like necessarily beaten in 10 minutes or less. Despite that, I really appreciate the efforts the devs made in fixing some of the more raw parts of Prithviraj, and this is one I definitely recommend giving another go. Last but not least for today, we complete our clockwise rotation of South Asia by turning to the mountains, deserts, and plains of North India and even Central Asia with Babur. Lasting from 1497 to 1527, Babur is going to be AoE2 DE's showcase of the Hindustani civilization, aka the reworked Indians from before Dynasties of India. With Devapala serving as the Buddhist campaign and Rajendra as the Hindu campaign, the Basi-designed Babur campaign will represent the third major Middle Ages Indian religion, Islam. Babur was the famous founder of the Mughal Empire, who fled the crumbling Timurid Empire of Central Asia to conquer much of northern India. Indeed, you actually begin this campaign as the Tatar civilization, but will then quickly switch over to the new, old Hindustanis as you make the transition from Central Asian cavalry to northern Indian camels, infantry, and elephants. Interestingly, this is only the second campaign to have you play in the orange color, with the first being Genghis Khan all the way back in 1999. Yes, I know you used to be orange in Prithviraj in HD, but that doesn't count. Regarding its difficulty, Babur is considered a 2-sword campaign, and I'd say that this is accurate enough. Its scenarios are generally pretty straightforward, but the difficulty level is quite a bit higher than something like Devapala. So with all of that set up, let's journey back to Transoxiana to visit some familiar locations and dynamics. We begin our Mughal adventures with Pearl of the East. This scenario is centered around the city of Samarkand, to which a young Babur must lay claim, pushing out the Timurid usurpers in the process. You begin in the dead of night and must defend your small camp from attackers. However, this is not too difficult, and upon recognizing the men as belonging to your jealous uncles, you get a town center, some villagers, and can go on your way to besieging Samarkand. There are 3 castles in and around the city, and destroying each will bring some of that section of the city under your control. Although initially alone, you can recruit allies from some of the other Timurid nobles who have camps in the surrounding area, as well as raid the Uzbeks for trebuchets. Once the hostile Timurids are defeated and you gain control of Samarkand, Shaibani Khan of the Uzbeks sees his opportunity to strike and unleashes his horde against you. Still, your army is superior, and taking out their sprawling camp to the north and east of the map will win you the mission. So I'd say that Pearl of the East is a nice introduction to the Babur campaign and gives you a good taste as to what to expect going forward. The overall gameplay is quite straightforward, with most of it being build and destroy/destroy targets. That said, things are still kept fresh with the various bonus objectives, and I at least always enjoy crushing stuff with the Tatars. Interestingly, you begin in the Imperial Age with a pop limit of 150, which might seem like a lot for an intro scenario, but as the outro slides reveal, Shaibani Khan of the Uzbeks returns in the spring and forces you to flee, making this campaign kind of have you work backwards. Lastly, I always appreciate a nice throwback to the Age of Kings campaigns, and in case you didn't notice, Samarkand is heavily based off of the Samarkand you see in Genghis Khan 4. We've already done the last Khans, so the second Babur scenario is going to be the last Timurids, which I suppose makes it the last Khans. Now on the run, Babur and his mother Kutlug must make their way from Transoxiana through the deserts and mountains of Afghanistan to find shelter. You begin in a small village to the north of the map and travel west to Herat, where you are welcomed by Babur's uncle. However, upon reaching the city, you find your relative to be dead and must take charge of the defenses against the impending attack of the Uzbek armies. There is not much gold on the map, but Herat will give you some for every every Uzbek unit or building you destroy. Speaking of which, there are two Uzbek factions you need to defeat. The northern Uzbeks are represented by the Mongols, and the southern Uzbeks are represented by the Cumans. Each has a sprawling camp with plenty of towers and soldiers, and attacking one could leave you vulnerable to an attack from the other. In addition, there is the rich city of Kabul to the east, whose warlord offers you an alliance. However, your choice here doesn't really matter much, as either way he'll betray and attack you, and only upon capturing the city's monument will you win the scenario. So the Last Timurids represents the campaign's shift towards South Asia, as from now on you play as the Hindustani civilization. It's interesting to see this shift from being this powerful and wealthy ruler of Samarkand to just being a poor fugitive simply trying to find a semblance of shelter. This is reflected by the fact that you only have a 125 pop limit and can no longer reach the Imperial Age. Another nice touch here is that Herat has the same design as you find it in Tamerlane 2, and I always appreciate some consistency. When it comes to gameplay, I'd say this mission is very straightforward, without many gimmicks or side quests beyond tributing 300 gold for siege elephants. That said, this is really your introductory level to the Hindustanis, so I'd say that the simplicity is fine here. Next up we have Babur 3, Into India, which is a nice parallel to Genghis Khan 3, Into China. Babur now controls Afghanistan and is tempted by the riches of northern India. Looking to plunder some of that sweet loot, you begin with a small camp to the north of the map and must accumulate 10,000 gold from raids. This differs somewhat from Attila 3 and Tamerlane 5 in that the gold counter can only go up, meaning you can spend as much as you like, however that counter can only be increased via plundering and not by mining gold using the market or collecting relics. Now with access to 200 population and the Imperial Age, this is going to be a very large-scale raid, with the player given 3 Indian cities from which to choose: Lahore to the west, Ludhiana to the south, and Jalandhar to the east. Each of these cities are large and well defended, but importantly, your enemies are hostile to one another as well as yourself, so you can pick them apart piece by piece. To loot gold, you simply need to take out various economic buildings and units from each of your enemies. These include markets, trade workshops, universities, trade carts, etc. In addition, you can recruit the support of the Yusufzai to the north if you free their stone mines from local Afghan bandits. Although it bears some similarities to Into China, Into India differs from Babur's ancestor in that it is far, far easier. It is not difficult to simply boom up to 120 villagers in the Imperial Age before any enemy attacks come in, and even when you do face opposing armies, they're not really anything you can't handle. The flavor is totally there, and thematically the scenario works when conveying the idea of a large-scale raid, but your enemies simply roll over and die at the first attack. There is also a nice Easter egg to Genghis Khan 5 with some trapped monks that were stuck in an avalanche for 15 days, and if you show them the way down, they will gladly join your army. And this Easter egg really exemplifies the mission as a whole. Very flavorful, fun power-trippy gameplay with the Hindustanis, but ultimately lacking in substance. Now that we have dipped our toes into India, it's time to launch a full-scale invasion of the crumbling Delhi Sultanate in the 4th Babur scenario, the Battle of Panipat. You begin to the north of the map in the small but fairly well-defended village of Panipat. Your target, Ibrahim Lodi and the Delhi Sultanate, hold a massive fortress to the south, but you don't need to worry about them just yet. Much like in Tamerlane 6, you have some time to weaken the Delhi army as much as possible before the outright battle begins. There are only a few different tasks, but completing each will prove a significant help. First, the 2 Delhi commanders of Daulat and Alam Khan each hold camps to the west and east respectively, and converting them will switch their allegiance to your side. Second, to the north of the map is a moderately well-defended road which holds the supplies for your Ottoman allies. Bringing those to your camp will allow you to train gunpowder. Finally, there are 5 trade workshops located on the map, and destroying each will reduce the amount of enemy units thrown at you. With all of the preparation complete, you must hold off the massive onslaught of Ibrahim Lodi for 25 minutes. It'll be tough, but once you accomplish that, you can go for a counterattack to defeat the Delhi Sultanate and win the scenario. So the Battle of Panipat is your big battle against a powerful enemy type scenario of the Babur campaign, and I definitely say that you can feel the step up in intensity. You don't have much time to complete your objectives, and holding off the Delhi Sultanate's attack can be tricky, particularly due to the limited gold on the map. It really is just a huge mosh pit of soldiers constantly pushing back and forth, which is exactly what you want in a scenario to feature a very famous large-scale battle like Panipat. Yes, it is somewhat derivative of Tamerlane 6, but I feel like the Battle of Panipat does a much better job in giving you the pitched fight against a massive army, and like I said, even accomplishing the objectives does not give you a free win. With Babur's position in northern India secure, it's time to look to the west in the final scenario, the Rajputs. The Delhi Sultanate was unable to subdue these kingdoms of western India, and now you need to accomplish what your predecessors could not. You begin in control of the small city of Agra to the south center of the map, and are immediately presented with a couple of choices: to defeat the kingdoms of Mewar and Amber, or to build and defend a wonder. Either way, it will be helpful to repair the town centers of the various local villages scattered across the map, as the grateful peasants will provide you with resources and markets to trade at. When it comes comes to your enemies, both Mewar and Amber hold powerful Imperial Age cities to the north and west of the map, with Mewar being the slightly stronger of the two. They'll send a variety of Gujjar units at you, so this is certainly the time to make full use of the Hindustani tech tree. In addition to the Rajput kingdoms, some Portuguese merchants have been selling gunpowder to your enemies, and their camp is located to the southwest. Destroying their Praetoria will put an end to their mercantile ways. Lastly, some mercenaries from Afghanistan have a camp to the northeast of the map, and will ask you for 1,000 gold to hire their services. Should you pay them, they will actually be quite useful allies and launch constant attacks against the Rajputs. So speaking of which, what to think of the Rajputs as a scenario? I would say it's a decent all-around ending to the Babur campaign. You face a couple of powerful enemies in Mewar and Amber, and the damaged villages give you something to do when building up your army. That said, the level is still quite straightforward and very easy, which is especially perplexing given the difficulty of the previous level. Still, the gameplay is solid, and you even get a good opportunity to make use of the Caravanserai building to boost your trade carts, so that's always nice. Okie dokie, with the scenarios of the Babur campaign complete, it's time to take a look at the overall strengths and weaknesses. I'd say we have an interesting mixed bag here. Starting as always with the strengths, the biggest thing going in favor of Babur is just how solid the gameplay is. Even if some of the scenarios are a bit on the easy side, I still think the overall experience you get as playing the Hindustanis in the Babur campaign is just straight up fun. This is definitely one of those power trippy sorts of campaigns where you tend to get huge Imperial Age armies with which to smash your opponents, but is differentiated from something like Devapala in that you actually tend to be limited in resources. It may seem like an odd thing to focus on, but how many resources you have access to, most especially gold and stone, but also food, wood, and even trade, can drastically impact how a scenario plays out. For instance, if resources are somewhat scarce, then that forces the player to go out more aggressively in order to control strategic points in the map and potentially open themselves up to enemy raids. Babur has a lot of this, and beyond forcing the player to be a bit smarter, it also encourages them to utilize the very efficient options available to the Hindustani Civ, whether that be camels, gunpowder, gulams, or even cav archers. Relatedly, I also appreciate the almost U-shaped progression that we see throughout the Babur campaign. By this, I mean that we start our adventures being powerful, potentially commanding a large post-Imperial Age city in the first scenario, but after getting defeated, you need to seek the aid of simple peasants and then slowly build your way back up again. The second scenario has you in search of a new home, and then you end up in control of Kabul. From there, you can look south to the even richer lands of India, but are still focused on raids rather than a full-scale invasion. That has to wait until the fourth scenario, where you're finally powerful enough to challenge the Delhi Sultanate in a head-on, huge pitched battle, notably gaining access to Hindustani gunpowder in the process. Finally, the last scenario has your power once again reach its zenith as you dispatch the Rajputs to create the Mughal Empire. It's not a traditional sort of progression that we see in an AoE2 campaign, but that just makes the gameplay feel that much more interesting. Still, Babur certainly has his fair share of flaws. I feel a lot of these stem from one core issue. This campaign feels too short. I'm not saying that all campaigns need 6 scenarios. For instance, Devapala and Rajendra feel like complete stories with only 5 levels, but in the case of Babur, something is lacking. Part of this certainly comes from the fact that you start in Transoxiana and play as the Tatars, meaning you need to wait until the second scenario to really get the narrative rolling. That makes Babur 2 also necessarily an introductory mission, this time giving you a feel for the Hindustani Civ. Those 2 missions together take up 40% of the campaign, which is quite a lot for just introducing a player to a story and civilization. After that, you get this odd jump where you go from 125 max pop in the Castle Age to 200 population post-Imperial Age for 3 missions in a row. It just feels like a rather large gap between the second and third missions, and things kind of stagnate in the latter half of the campaign, with the addition of gunpowder being the only noticeable difference between 3 build and destroy scenarios. Lastly, I just have to say that something feels off in the narrative. Babur tells his own story, and his accounts oscillate from being lighthearted to melancholy and alone. I'm not really sure why this is the case, and although this certainly isn't enough to ruin the experience by any means, it just makes me feel weird. Alrighty kiddos, for one last time today, we need to place a campaign on the tier list. In our community poll, we can see that according to just under 1,000 of you guys, Babur belongs in the A tier. However, for my rating, I'm gonna break with you all a little bit and bump Babur down to the B tier. This is one of the few campaigns that I would say feels weaker than the sum of its parts. The gameplay of the individual scenarios is pretty good, even if it is a bit on the easier side. I'd also say that the 4th level really stands out as being both challenging and fun. However, when we piece these levels together to form the somewhat odd narrative from Babur, things start to fall a bit flat. Still, even if I think this was the weakest entry from Dynasties of India, we do get another campaign in the orange color, and you get to smash stuff with camels, gulams, and gunpowder, so those reasons alone should be enough for you to play Babur. And with that, we are actually done. Ornlu's AoE2 DE campaign review and tier list series is complete. We've gone through all 33 official campaigns, and now you can see the finalized tier list. I'm honestly happy with the distribution across the tiers, and this goes to show that the AoE2 campaigns are on average quite strong. Still, with all of that said, we could very well be getting more AoE2 expansions, and if/when that happens, this series will fire right back up again. Therefore, all I can say is thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.